Hi there, welcome back. What I'm going to be looking at now is some techniques that not only apply to this shot that we've been working on here, but can be applied to anything where we work with alpha channels that define the difference between a foreground element and a photographic backplate. So for example, in this case, we've got an alpha channel that will define where this foreground robot ends and where this background begins. And if this was a green screen shot that we've keyed out, we would have a foreground person or object that's been shot against green. That will then had its green keyed out, and we'll have an alpha channel as well to define where it is and where it isn't. What we're going to do is use that information to create some edge blending to better blend the edges of our foreground element with our background element, but also use that same mat to create a light wrap, where light hits an object and then wraps around the edges. Okay, so these are finishing touches that can be applied to any compositing workflow, and the techniques that I'm going to use in Blender can be pretty much applied to layer-based compositing in, say, something like After Effects or another nodal compositor such as Nuke or Fusion. Okay, so this is going to be an experiment really just to see how we can just give this some finishing touches. Now, to help me before I start, I'm just going to work within the nodal window, and I'm going to expand this because I don't need to render anymore. So to expand this window, I'm going to go Control up arrow to expand it, and then I'm going to change the background image here to fit, so we can really see what we're doing. We can see our render and our composite at the same time that we are using our nodes. So if we press zoom in and out with our middle mouse button, it just zooms in and out of our nodes, but without interfering with our background image. Middle mouse button is to pan our nodes around over the top and work on this while we can still see things here. Okay, so as you can see, this is the same node structure I left from my last video guide looking at this particular composite. But what I've done is tidied these things up. So any of the nodes to do with the foreground element, I've grouped together. And you simply do that by selecting a number of nodes, coming down to where it says nodes, and then you make group from the selected nodes. To get into these, you just select this group and press Tab key, and that opens up the nodes within that node group. I find it's a good way to tidy things and organize things once you're got to a stage where it's logical. So what I'm going to do is work on this edge map. So I'm going to leave the shadow node below here, and I'm going to select my edge group or my foreground element group. I'm going to tab in, and you can see I've got my ID mask. If I Control Shift click this, you can see there's the mat that we're going to be using. There's the dilate and erode that's eroding that edge and softening it and feathering it. I've also got a sharpening node that just sharpens the image a little bit. And then we've got the output of that combined amount. So if we tab out, what I'm going to do is actually ungroup this particular group so I can start to work with those nodes separately again. So I'm just going to select it, come to node and ungroup. And there we go, there's our nodes back in the root level chain, as it were. So let's come up here. Let's move everything about. Let's Control Shift click, because we're using the node wrangler, remember, that's why we can Control Shift click at any of these nodes to see them at that stage. So it's this ID mask and this dilate erode, yeah? We want to make sure we work with these two. If we use just the ID mask before it was eroded, it will be working with a mat that's edges are defined slightly further out, so that's going to give us inexact results. So we need to make sure we take both the ID mask and its dilate erode. So basically this ID mask, if we Control Shift click on it, is our alpha mat. White means on, black means off. So this could have been generated via a keyer, say for example on green screen, or it could have been used as a mask. Wherever you've got a black and white mat that defines where things are on and where things are off, you can apply this same technique. So I'm going to try and define the very edges of this. And what we're going to do is use then this edge mat that we're going to create to then blur just the edges of our foreground object with the pixels of the background object. Okay, so what I'm going to do is select both of these nodes, so Shift click both, or you can just simply lasso both. I'm going to go Control Shift D to keep their connections. So Shift D would just duplicate them. Control Shift D keeps their input connected. So if you see now, if I Control Shift click on this, it looks exactly the same. And we're going to use this over here. We're going to build an edge mat. So not just a mat that defines where the object is, but where its edges are. So I'm going to add to this. I'm going to go Add, Color, Mix Node. And I'm going to plug this in here. So if we see this, and then if I was to make this pink, you can see this has gone slightly pink. If we multiply it, you can see that the white has gone, the black has stayed, and now this purple has appeared. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is plug the same mat into both inputs. So it's matting itself over itself. Okay, but what I'm going to do is invert one of these inputs. So if we go Add, Color, Invert, and plug that into there, what we're then left with is the same mat talking to itself, but there's an inverted version. And because we're using multiply, it's basically getting rid of the white pixels of this one, which is the background, yeah, putting it over the top of that, and we're left with this little edge. So that is now giving us a white edge. So if we apply this to a blur node, we can say blur where this is white, but don't blur where this is black. In other words, blur the edges. So we've already got our edge map. But what we would like to do is have this white be more pronounced and it to kind of feather off so the blur is more natural and organic. So what we can do then is go Add, Filter, Blur. And if we add a blur to this bottom one, we can see what happens. So let's put it on Fast Gaussian. Let's take this up a bit. And what we're left with is this kind of halo. Yeah. We could also, let's go Shift D and drop this on this blur. And then what we could do is put like a little soft one on this one. Okay, so this is basically this bottom inverted mat is acting as the kind of white hot center of this thin line. And this second version, the non-inverted version with our blurring, is creating this little thing here. What I would like to do then, I'm kind of happy with the way that that rolls off. So let's make that fit again. We can zoom in a bit by dragging this window over here. We can just zoom in and out. And you see we've got this slight fall off and this slightly hotter center, which is this bottom one. I'd like to make that hotter center be more pure white to give it a punch. So to do that, I'm going to add color and then curves. So let's look for a curves adjustment, RGB curves. Let's drop that after the blur. And I'm just going to put an S curve in here. You can see that that white is getting hotter. And then we could pull it down here just to tighten that up a bit. So let's just get it there. We can keep playing with this until it looks about right. So if I was just to select this node and press M for mother, and what that does is mute that node. You can see before and after, before and after, and we're just giving it a bit of punch, just like so. So before, after. And what that's done is just slightly harden this edge. So I might just duplicate this blur and put it afterwards, just to soften that fall off just a tiny bit, like so. And then we can go back, and then we can just give this a little bit more punch. And you can just keep coming back. So basically we're just working hard to basically create an edge matte where white is going to mean blur the edges, grey is going to mean roll off. So if we come to our top blur, we can change that up even more. You can see it'll just soften this interaction here. We can tighten it up however we want to. Okay, so that's what these controls are doing. So the principles behind it are pretty sound, really. We're using that ID matte that we had from before, the matte that defines where the foreground object is and isn't, and we're using it just to blur the edges of our matte. And we've found the edges, we've created this edge matte. White's going to mean blur the edges, black's going to mean no blur at all. So now we've got this edge matte, we can actually, let's use the grouping now to group these together. So let's select them all, look, like so. And let's simply then go node, make group, and it automatically shows you inside the group. Let's tab out with a tab key. And we've got this new node group with all those nodes inside. We can come to the nodes just here, and in the properties we'll give it a name, and we'll call this edge matte, and that'll have that name here. We can also give it a color, so let's come to where it says color, tick this, press on the color tab, and let's give it some bright color. There we go. That's now our edge matte done. So where do we apply this? Well, what we need to do is, if we come to the last node that we had before this tutorial, we had our finished composite as we saw it. And what we need to do is blur these pixels into one another. So we want them both together at this stage before we apply the blur of our edge matte. So fundamentally then, we want to blur after this point. So what we need to do is go add color mix node. And let's just put a color into one of these channels so you can see what's happening. So let's view at this point, and you can see this is what we're seeing at this chain, the purple on top, yeah, and our image below, and we can fade that up and down. Now if we plug our edge matte into the factor, that'll basically say, look, only put whatever's in this bottom socket over the top of it where it's white. So look, our edge matte is now working. It's now saying anything along the edge of this, based on this edge matte, make it pink. So that's a good start. So fundamentally now, if we were to plug in not pink, but this composite again, it would blur the pixels of our background into our edge. Like so, it's combined the two together. Okay? But we want this to be blurred before it plugs. We want a blurred version going over the top of this. So let's go add, filter blur. Let's plug that between there. Fast Gaussian, just to keep our render times up, and let's make this really blurry so you can see the difference. Now, what we're going to do is just zoom in. So look at these very edges. This is a subtle technique. I want you to focus on this line as I mute this blur on and off. So I'm going to press the M for mother key, mute, watch the edge, mute to turn it back on. And what we've done is soften that interaction here. Without, with, without, with. Okay, so if we were to look around this image, and if we now look at something that was already shot in the background plate, this young lady here, you can see her edges are naturally blurred. But one thing that was missing on our object, foreground object, that it wasn't, and it was looking a bit too crisp because of it. So let's mute this again. Let's look at the similarity of these edges here. Look, and you can see. Oh, we've zoomed too far. There we go. So just study the edges here. I'm going to mute it again. Mute. Hard edge, look. Mute. You can see we've brought that softness back. So if we were to bring this back to fit, seemingly not much has changed, but it's given us mute off, mute on. It just gives us some edge softness that makes this integrate even better. So that's how to do edge blurring.